So welcome everybody to this last keynote session. Let me do so as if we all wouldn't know you, Robert, okay? Robert Hatten from the University of Texas at Austin is one of the most respected musicologists, not only in the United States, but in the whole world. The ICMS community are privileged to count him as one of his most regular keynote speakers. His last book on virtual agency culminates a trilogy on musical signification, and especially on the classic and romantic repertoire that uses semiotic, topical, rhetorical, and intertextual tools to achieve a known theory of music. Today he will use his own term melos, to illustrate his theory of virtual subjectivity as it illuminates two wonderful standard works and their textures, Sebastian Bach's Partita in D major and Chopin's Nocturne in E flat major. Melos, the Latin word for melody, borrowed from the Greek, has been defined by Hatten, I quote, as a synthesis of melody, motive, harmony, and counterpoint into an integrative stream with a singular expressive purport. Robert will demonstrate at the piano some unexpected links between these stylistically so different two works by showing the melos as channeled through the experience of a virtual subjectivity. Thank you very much, dear Robert, for being here. Thank you.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and thanks to all who have made this conference such a wonderful gathering, from Mireia and all the others who have helped Joan's organization to produce such wonderful tours and conference presentations and keynotes and papers. We're looking forward to papers this afternoon, or after this one as well. Don't think that you've been forgotten. I also wanted to say I was so delighted that this conference had as its theme performance, because I feel very much, as we've seen, the interlinkages, and I know that you do as well in your classes, and many of you work with performers and try to find ways to make your theoretical and musicological ideas relevant to performance. The proof is in the pudding, as they say, and oftentimes if we don't have enough clinical evidence, historical or theoretical, for our points, sometimes we can be convincing just by playing. And then later years we'll find more reasons for or against a certain claim that we might make. Anyway, I've arranged this to be about a 40-minute paper, so we'll have time for questions after. An aria like Allemande by Bach and a nocturne by Chopin, although stylistically worlds apart, they share important features with respect to the treatment of texture in order to enhance the expressive richness of the melody. I've coined the term melos to characterize this synthesis of melody, motive, harmony, and counterpoint into an integrative stream with a singular expressive purport. I claim that this integrative stream of voices projects a complex virtual subjectivity akin to a stream of consciousness that is emergent from the presumed dialogue of individual contrapuntal lines or arpeggiated chords. I will explain how melos is compositionally cued in analogous ways by both Bach and Chopin, and I will demonstrate how these insights matter for performance. I begin with a brief overview of my theory of virtual agency, which involves four what I call transformative inferences. The first is virtualizing, when one hears the gestural energies of the music as having their source within the music, as actions by as yet unspecified actants. The second transformative inference involves embodying, or imagining those unspecified actants as virtual human agents, whose actions and emotions are exemplified and expressed by gestural energies. The third inference is that of fictionalizing, or imagining those virtual embodied human agents as though they were actors or characters in a human drama or narrative. And finally, interiorizing, which occurs when we imagine those virtual, embodied, and fictionalized human actors as part of a larger, singular virtual subjectivity. At this highest level, listeners identify their own subjectivity with the virtual subjectivity expressed by the music, situating it as relevant to their own experience and capacity for exploration. If one is inclined to imagine each voice in a musical work as a potential actant, then how might one combine multiple actants into a fully embodied virtual agent? The techniques of mellows can help one integrate multiple voices into a singular stream of intentionality. If one then hears multiple actors as differentiated by more than one stream of intentionality, once again, the techniques of mellows can help one to conceive of each virtual actor as an interactive thought, emotion, reaction, or more generally, motivation within that singular virtual subjectivity. An interiorized drama of the mind, if you will. Let's see how these techniques might work, first for Bach and then for Chopin. None of Bach's earlier Allemands could have even prepared you for an encounter with the Allemande from his keyboard partita number 4 in D major. It is twice the typical length of Bach's previous Allemands, and it features an expanded second strain that both develops and returns significant material without, however, preserving its order. Furthermore, this Allemande is conceived as a character piece. Unlike typical Allemands, this one topically imports an Italian aria. The prevailing texture appears on paper to involve 3 voices, a cantilena in the treble, supported by tenor and bass voices in slower note values. The melody is basically stepwise, but its expressive leaps create fleeting compound melody effects, enhancing the main melody as mellows. But this cantilena is also expressively intensified by progressive diminutions, from ornamental figures to subdivisions of sixteenths, triplet sixteenths, and ultimately 32nd notes. In measure 2, we find finger pedal in the treble line when a given pitch is given an extra stem, and note head if needed, indicating that it is to be held beyond the length implied by its melodic figure. This sustaining voice may suggest an extra line, creating a fleeting 4-voice texture, although its primary function in measure 2 appears to be an enrichment of harmony as sonorous unfolding. In measure 3, the undulant melody does begin to suggest a compound melody by falling away from the C natural and then picking that voice up again in measure 3. The leap to E also opens another voice, which is then echoed at the very end of measure 3 and continued with the D on the last beat of measure 4. By contrast, the lower voices are written as 2 discrete lines whose give and take rhythms feature an alternating series of attack points between the lines. Interestingly, the same effect could have been achieved by notating a single voice with finger pedal indications to bring out a compound line. Remarkably then, the entire texture of the opening 4 measures attains the sonorous richness of 4-part harmony through just 2 chains of attack points, notated differently in each hand, but each featuring a compounding of lines. With the first elaboration of the melody, beginning at measure 5, the double-stranded lower voice becomes more active and shifts to a middle register, arpeggiating in eighths to form a melodic harmonic merger that both supports and enhances the upper melody. Finger pedal sustains the bass, enhancing the beauty of suspensions on the downbeats of measures 6 and 8. Meanwhile, the melody also moves into a higher tessitura, marking the beginning of a freely spun out Fortspinnung. By this weaving of a richer texture, Bach achieves not only the illusion of harmonic sustaining, but the merger of harmony with interactive melodic gestures, creating an integrative and continuous mellows. So I'll start at the end of measure 4. In measures 7 to 8, a half-bar sequencing of the melody down by thirds, which you also just now heard, is enhanced by contrary motion in rising arpeggio sequences. This wedge-like motion exemplifies a sense of inwardness that supports virtual subjectivity as a kind of interiority. Beginning with an energetic triplet gesture, the 2-bar passage integrates melody and, quote, accompaniment by merging texturally on the 3rd beat of measure 8, which we heard right here. So the hands come together. A new pattern arises in measure 9 with further diminution of the triplet figure to a 32nd note pair. The melody further integrates with the lower compound melody, responding to its gently resolving sevenths with these exquisite motivic embellishments. The triplets then return after the climax in measure 10, and the 3 voices again merge by means of a closing wedge for a 2-bar variant of the passage in measures 11 to 12. So I'll start this time in measure 9. So we're halfway through the first strain on a half cadence in the dominant key of A major. But cadential resolution now to the tonic A will be delayed by multiple prolongations and deceptive evasions that reveal an extraordinarily long-range and emotionally dramatic conception of the tonal discourse. So, the extended delay of the structural cadence begins in measure 13, where Bach features a striking layering of rhythmic textural counterpoint in 3 voices. 3 virtual agents are here interacting as virtual actors that merge into a virtual subjective stream of consciousness. The soprano is all 16ths and 32nds, the tenor all in eighths, and the finger pedaling of its compound line sustains a dominant pedal point in the bass. This moment of functional stasis, harmonic stasis, focuses on inward reflection, as mimed by the convoluted diminished contours in the treble. When in measure 15, the E pedal moves deceptively to F, soon understood as a neighboring chord with its own brief prolongation, the inward ruminations are intensified expressively with a diminished 7th sonority on the downbeat. Bach ensures the sonorous intensification of harmony by finger pedaling every note in the arpeggiated dominant at the end of measure 14. The distinction of lower lines is lost within this congealing of harmony. So I'll start here in the half cadence and play through the second beat of measure 15. It's hard to resist. So a renewed pedal point on 5 of A major supports the temporary split in the tenor into 2 voices in measure 16, and the end of measure 17 features a similar split of the treble into brief soprano and alto lines. So these contrapuntal unfoldings create brief 4-voice enrichments of the ongoing dominant prolongation. But as you just heard, the next deceptive resolution was even more impressive. Again to F in the bass with a diminished 7th that then collapses inwardly into another diminished 7th above F sharp in the bass. So we heard. Interesting voice leading there, 2 tritones. Suggesting to me an inward qualm of disquieting emotion. When the dominant is restored at the end of measure 17 for what promises to finally be the long withheld cadence, there is yet another deferral, this time to an ameliorating 4/6 chord, expressively marked by a poignant 7/6 suspension on the downbeat of measure 18. So let me pick it up on the third beat, pick up of measure 15. Ameliorating, oh, wonderful. Okay. Texture here is not merely a coloristic device employed in an improvisatory fashion, but it is coordinated with tonal structure and indeed with every other structuring element to produce an integrated expressive effect. This is what Margorjata in her paper recalled my calling the Ausdrucktur, the integration of expression and structure. I'd forgotten about that pun, sorry. So next example, okay. Although the aria plus accompanying voices is contrapuntal and the lower voices even occasionally echo each other's motives, the closing section of each strain of the Allemande focuses all 3 voices in a more tightly coordinated expressive purport by use of a contrapuntal scaffolding, integrating 5/6 motion between the lower voices with parallel tense between the bass and treble. The extended 6-bar passage ending the first strain begins with this sequence because it still has tonal work to accomplish. The previous 4/6 deferral of tonic was briefly tonicized by 5/7 of 4 at the end of measure 18, and as a result, the closural section begins in measure 19 on what we hear as the subdominant. A chromatic 5/6 sequence in the lower voices then progresses in 2 measures from D in the bass to A at measure 21. In just these 2 bars, the 3 voices work together like clockwork, and the free play of both contour and diminutions in the treble is supported by both the contrapuntal scaffolding and the further support in parallel tense. Thus, all 3 voices ascend in coordinated sequential fashion. Nothing new here, but it's just another way of thinking of counterpoint as being motivated by this need to coordinate voices into a singular purport. And of course, this is the reason why in Baroque counterpoint, you have these extended passages of sequences in 3rd, 6th, and 10th, which you would not have in Fuchsian counterpoint, say, any more than you'd have the tritone as a structural interval in Fuchsian counterpoint, but which of course is necessary, as we know. Where the perfect 4th resolves to the tritone, right? Mozart. Okay. Okay, So let's play that example. In my work on virtual agency, I use this excerpt as an especially clear example of melos, the merger or complementarity of multiple voices working together to create a singular purport and thereby suggest the agency of a singular virtual subjectivity. Although hearing a single performer play all the voices in an intimate movement such as this may already tilt the listener toward an integrative mode of listening, such integration must nevertheless be compositionally staged by the composer. And in fact, counterpoint is a highly effective way of weaving multiple voices together, not only to support progression, but also to merge thematic and linear purport. While heterophony in other musical styles can stage a communal singularity of purport in fascinating and valuable ways, the integrative fusion of counterpoint is not only linearly, but also harmonically, thematically, and texturally coordinated. I will now play the complete first strain of the Allemande so you can experience its cohesive musical discourse, as achieved through the remarkable textural integration of melodic, motivic, harmonic, and contrapuntal strands into this unitary expressive purport, a singular virtual subjectivity. Listen at the end for the example that's not shown. One more dramatic expansion of the texture before Bach finally delivers his long-awaited cadence to A major. I turn now to Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 55, number 2, which exhibits a textural sophistication far exceeding not only the vocal duet nocturne or the piano nocturnes of John Field, but also Chopin's own earlier nocturnes. The melody begins, unusually, on an unsupported B-flat, then leaps down to a trill supported by the entrance of the left hand's expansive arpeggiation. Thus, textural enhancement of the melody through harmonic arpeggiation is premised from the beginning. Furthermore, the leaping melody creates its own counterpoint through its compounding of voice leadings, which one can illustrate simply by sustaining the pitches preceding each leap. notes accelerates rhythmically in 3 stages, from dotted halves to dotted quarters, and finally to quarter plus eighth rhythms. And this acceleration supports the merger of these 2 voice leadings into the one voice by measure 3.
Excuse me, Robert. Could you please
Okay.
following on that?
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. I'll say that again. The melody begins on, let's see, the textural enhancement and the leaping melody creates its own counterpoint. The melos accelerates rhythmically in 3 stages, and then this acceleration supports the merger of these 2 voice leadings into one voice by measure 3. Note also the directional purport provided by the descending step progression in the upper line, from B flat in measure 1 to A flat, G, F in measure 3, resolution to E flat in measure 4. Thus, in the opening measures, Chopin stages both a sudden textural enhancement and a much more gradual linear merger of 2 voices in a way that internalizes counterpoint into his melos from the start. Of course, harmony has always served as an enhancement of melody, both through the expressive character of individual sonorities and their syntactic implications. But the flexibility of arpeggiation is doubly productive for Chopin, not only providing depth of resonance across multiple octaves, but sustaining that resonance through the added resource of the sustaining pedal. You notice I did not use pedal at all in the Bach. Chopin's arpeggiation goes still further by incorporating stepwise pairs that contrapuntally refract and thus further enhance the melodic substance. Note, for example, how the peak of the arpeggiation from measures 1 to 2 is foregrounded registrally and complements the melody through motivic refraction. A flat to G in the left hand not only supports the D to E flat resolution in the melody, but subtly anticipates the A flat to G that will appear on measures 2 to 3, beats 2 to 3 of measure 2. So let me play the first 4 bars. The next phrase of the nocturne introduces a shadow duet in the alto voice that replicates the structural descent from B flat to E flat of the first 4 bars. Although this complementary voice is now nearly unbroken, it remains subordinate to and refractive of the melody's own stepwise motion. This shadow duet has a degree of rhythmic independence and even introduces its own motive in bridging measures 5 to 6. But the rhythmic give and take, at least in my own interpretation, serves primarily to help resonate the longer sustained pitches in the melody. So starting on the last beat of measure 4. The next phase of the nocturne introduces, this resonating function is heard most strikingly at the end of measure 7, what I just played, where the rhythmic diminution creates 8 against 3, an acceleration of the 4 against 3 introduced on the downbeat. This is not so much a competing line as a reverberating enhancement of the A flat in the melody, expressively endowing it with a thrilling shudder, perhaps. Furthermore, by playing the 16ths gesturally rather than robotically evenly, the performer can impart a delicious sense of improvisatory free will to the melos, thereby enhancing its human agency. And since this inner voice enhances the affect of the sustained pitch, it marks a kind of interiority in the embodiment of the melody. Such marks of interiority help stage a virtual subjectivity, which may in turn more deeply engage the listener. A similar reverberant, thrilling shudder is used to great effect at the climax in measures 35 to 36. Already, the thrilling expectation of a trilled anacrusis in measure 34 leads to a freer diminution in the return of the melody, with its subdivision into an asymmetrical 7 pitches against 6 in the arpeggiation. The alto voice on the 4th bar inverts and accelerates this diminution, very refractively. But notice how it avoids competing with the upper line's lyricism. Besides the interiorizing, almost parenthetical speed of the figure, the left hand inserts an extra A flat, creating a still further subdivision that produces an asymmetrical burst of energy, a little spark, if you will. That energy is absorbed by the sustained D in the melody as not merely a means of resonating, but also of further characterizing its emotional affect, thereby enriching the dimensionality of the melos, as also seen in the alto in measure 38. So I'll start playing measure 35. Did you hear that effect? Let me try it again. A more delicate form of enhancement, one involving traditional contrapuntal scaffolding, is found just before this climactic passage in measures 31 to 32. Here, the right hand has a shadow dialogue that enhances the upper sustained pitches in a kind of compound melody featuring decorative 4/3 and 2/3 suspensions on the 2nd and 3rd beats, respectively. This melos is enhanced by the left hand's 2 to 3 bass suspensions, moving from the 3rd to the 4th beat of each measure. Thus, the entire sequential descent is an expressive elaboration of a basic contrapuntal descent in 6th between the outer voices, found on beats 1 and 4 of each measure. The elaboration of the inner alto voice as interiorizing the melody is coordinated by the scaffolding of the counterpoint into a singular melos that enhances its virtual subjectivity. When played delicately, it becomes an extraordinary moment of interiority, one that effectively sets up the climactic outburst to come. I'll begin in measure 30 and play through to the thrilling climactic resolution to tonic on the downbeat of measure 35. Note how the sequence is varied in measure 33 as the bass shifts to arrive on the dominant, but the soprano-alto melos continues, even under the trills in measure 34, thanks to discrete participation by the left hand. So starting at measure 30. So you could hear that build-up. In measure 52, the thrilling reverberation of a trill in the subordinate voice also helps to enhance the upper line, but relative pitch stasis in both voices lends the melos an anticipatory quality, and attention then shifts to an emergent melodic contribution in the left hand. The refractive step pair motive in the left hand accelerates and helps direct the melos to measure 53, at which point the upper lines do begin to move. By measure 54, the inevitable merger of soprano and alto is marked by successive 6th, octave, and 10th enhancements of the climactic C. So I will now play that example, starting in the 2nd bar of example 12, where the left hand begins to emerge. The next example illustrates how a single line descent in the melody is extended through 4 octaves using a variety of techniques supporting its enhancement as mellows. This passage is part of the post-cadential expansion of the tonic resolution we just heard, a kind of transcendent release to major after a turn towards the parallel minor in the previous measure. 2 octave transfers take us to the very high B flat in measure 58, from which a decorated descent implies compound melody once more. The linear descent shifts from the upper to the second voice at measure 59, marked by the triplet rhythm that at first slows down the 4-note groupings and then accelerates into quintuples. The upper voice leaves its trace as a reiterated upper pedal on B flat, while the lower voice continues its decorated oblique descent. After the upper pedal dissipates, the quintuplets enact their own subdivision into 2 lines, featuring contrary motion in measure 61. This expansive stepwise wedge leaves the listener hanging on an unresolved dominant 7th over the ongoing tonic pedal, which has been happening since 59. But when the cadenza-like upper descent finally coagulates into block harmonies in measure 62, the cadence is shifted to a plagal 4-1 over tonic pedal. Remember Bach? The final cadential tag echoes this revelatory process of emergent intervoicing, as explicitly marked by Chopin with the accents in the left hand at measure 64-65. This framing horn quartet serves to verticalize the dominant pedal over an augmentation of the turn figure that was introduced by the descending quintuplets. This time, the 5/7 leads to ultimate, what I call poetic closure, as the accented turn figure resolves scale degree 4 in the left hand to scale degree 3 in the right hand, now on top of the tonic chord. I use the term poetic closure because the expressive sweetness of scale degree 3 is the ultimate goal of the nocturne's dramatic trajectory. And indeed, Chopin had already achieved syntactic closure to scale degree 1 with the perfect authentic cadence in measures 54 to 55. So let me just play that little horn quartet with the accented notes. Before I play the entire nocturne, if we have time, let me briefly summarize how the techniques Chopin uses to create mergers and demellos recall some of Bach's own strategies. We have seen both composers using compound melody created by leaps and sustaining of pitches to enrich their mellows. However, Bach's arpeggiations often begin as inner melody and, partially sustained through finger pedal, leave their trace as harmony. Whereas Chopin's use of the damper pedal allows his arpeggiations to begin as harmony, leading to emergent stepwise refractions of the melody. Both Bach and Chopin enhance melody through reverberant decoration, Chopin's more elaborate, of course, as well as refractive counterpoint and contrapuntal scaffolding to coordinate multiple voices into a singular expressive purport. Whereas Bach's harpsichord may have seemed limited in terms of sustaining capabilities, his textural invention enabled him to go beyond the surface sustaining effects of embellishments, as found in the style brisé of the claveciniste. His finger pedaling and contrapuntal techniques enable him to flesh out far richer and longer range harmonic and tonal spans. Chopin's textural virtuosity is further enhanced by his profound understanding of overtones and complex sonorities made possible by the damper pedal, and he also suggests far more than he notates. I leave these further hints to your own imagination as I perform the entire nocturne, if we have time. Okay. 10:46. Good, we did it. I know some people have to dash to catch planes, so thank you for coming.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you very much, Robert. Since there will be a lot of questions and dialogue, allow me to start with a question for you relating this key concept of interiority, which is so central to romantic art in general, but particularly here, and the relationship of this represented interiority and rubato. Because, of course, I don't think anybody here would even think of any other kind of rubato as you were displaying on the Chopin, representing probably this inner voice, somebody singing quasi for him or herself, and this other voice as a counterpoint, dialogue, not a love duet, I would say, but there's certainly these two voices in a intriguing relationship to each other, probably. But then, for the allemande, I wonder, if you take historically informed performances on cembalo, then you will find that the pulse of the accompaniment is firm, and the only rubato, subjective, would be on the singing voice, as if a singer was being accompanied by a firm continual player. But that is not what you're doing. Can you explain?
I'm guilty of romanticizing, it's true. I'm trying to play the gestures in a way that suits their sorry, maybe I should just hold the mic. Okay, thank you. All right, that's good. I'm trying to play the gestures in such a way that they project their expressive meaning. And I do try to keep the left hand steadier, but that's a flaw in my own performance. But there's one interesting point that I was listening to a harpsichordist play. There's a passage where at the end, let me just play this little spot. It's the passage with the sequence. And sure enough, he did it too. And in other words, that there is that kind of improvisatory freedom. It is, after all, an Italian aria, and so that one would have that in the right hand. But the left hand, I do try to regiment a little bit more, but when the left hand becomes melodic, as in those arpeggiated passages with their own suspensions, then I figure that the left hand, the continuo, now has a chance to be melodically expressive as part of the melos. So, but it's a good point. Thank you.
Any other comments, questions? Nobody? Oh, Peter.
Thank you so much for the wonderful revelations about these pieces. I was interested in your first exposition of the different actors and actants.
Maybe we can go back to that first content slide. If we take it all the way back to slide number 1 or 2. That's it. Leave it. Whoop.
Yeah, and actually, the slide that we just saw had something that you pointed out as horns.
Oh, yes.
And then I'm very aware that we've just been listening for some minutes now to a piano.
Yes.
And yet you characterize the agent as human.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder what your take is on the possibility of non-human agencies within this music.
Absolutely. in fact, we can float amongst these different levels, I think, quite nicely. But the horn quartet could very much be splitting into four, as it were. And it is a kind of a framing device. So if we were to take a narratological approach, we would be in the outer frame of an ending. He likes to do these kinds of extensive codas with multiple frames, in fact. But you can always take it back down to the level of the actant. And for example, we had some machine topics that were being discussed at this conference, right? And I think that very much can be a non-human, although we tend to humanize even the machine. You can take a piece by Stockhausen that's very pointillistic, you know, and you think, well, there's no continuity that would lend it a human gesture, but perhaps it could also be understood as neurons in the brain, right? Now, that doesn't seem particularly human, even though it is part of our humanity, right? It's metaphor, right? So we can have all kinds of metaphorical agents as well to make up for the lack of specific humane gestures, right? But when I was working on the book on gesture, one of the gestures that I found that had a little history of its own was this tum-tum. And I thought it was such an interesting gesture because it wasn't legato. In other words, there was space, but the gesture went over the space with a particular quality of motion. Tum-tum. Tom. And Schubert uses it, Beethoven uses it. You know, it just has this very human quality. Portato was mentioned by Joan the other day. And that also, for me, is the caressing touch of consoling someone. If you look at the portatos in that consolation of Liszt that begin with a portato repeated chord. It's not just because you don't want the repeated chord to be tied, but and Brahms especially, although he called it portamento, he meant portato. Tom is such a humane and such a touching and such a. I wrote about this in relation to the slow movement of the Brahms piano quartet. He set up that portato gesture at previous cadences, so when he elides into that theme, it just breaks your heart, you know. So, humane gestures versus other gestures. The reason I put it into four strata like this is that the philosophers were getting away with critiquing us, talking about personas as though we were making things up. And it was an impoverished notion of a persona. We needed to have all the levels so we could discriminate which elements we were claiming in any particular situation. Now, if you go back to, say, Hildegard of Bingen, I mean, wonderful chance. Is there actoriality? Is there subjectivity? Well, there's certainly subjectivity, but it may not have actoriality or human agency in the same way, although I would suspect those singing these chants are embodying them in a way that is very human but also very spiritual. So it's already going beyond the body into the spirit, the mind, the holiness of the and of course she wrote the first opera. But the devil doesn't get any tunes, right? Right. So you have actoriality already entering there as well. But I thought that these levels would enable us to be a little more nuanced in our claims about agency. And then by and behold, it gave me this new lens in which to think about even such obvious things as counterpoint or melody and accompaniment. The counterpoint that is not imitative or is not, imitative counterpoint is the trivial case of refractive counterpoint. But what if you have counterpoint that is not a counter subject, an independent counter subject, but simply refracts? Well, I had come across this in the Beethoven Hammerklavier fugue, where his first two counter subjects are clearly derived from the subject. And of course, he's saving, just as Bach would do for the second subject entry in the double fugue. So it will be the true counter subject. So those first ones are refractive. And the reason why Beethoven chose to use augmentation as his first device, a Baroque composer would say that for the last, right? It was because it could show very clearly the derivational relationship of his three voices. So course, you keep going back to Bach and find everything that you think you've discovered in later composers. And the ways in which Bach was using refractive counterpoint was utterly fascinating to me, to enhance, and thus this notion of melos from refractive counterpoint was the starting point. And then I started seeing it in many other dimensions, resonating, reverberant, whatever. So I hope that helps answer and goes beyond your question a bit.
Yes, after such value of beauty, only short remark. Chopin used to say, play Bach, always Bach, and sing as you play.
Yes.
Maybe this is a kind of oracle to all listeners, to all performers. Sing as you play and play Bach, always Bach.
Yes.
So thank you for this kind of oracle.
And you know, Jeffrey Kahlberg alerted me to a passage in a letter from one of Chopin's students. A German student was writing back to her family and said that Chopin had said, in playing fugues, don't bring out every voice, but play it for the spiritual content of the whole, melos. So I cite that in an article that's going to appear elsewhere. But I hope, by putting these two together, I made that point clear that Bach was so important to Chopin in terms of voice leading, but also in terms of texture now. We can see.
Robert, thank you for the wonderful exposition. I'd like to ask you about your, for example, about your example.
It's just turned off.
Oh, it's turned off. Okay. So, Robert, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful exposition. And I'd like to propose you some questions about, for example, your example number 7, in which you showed the progression, Bach's progression until bar 20. And here, for example, in the 3 voices, you have some important invariances. In the 3 of them, and they're moving together. You could think of that in a Schenkerian point of view, for example. Then there would be a direction, a clear direction.
In the example in the book.
Yes, and anyway. There would be some invariances, very clear invariances in each one of the voices, and the variants which would give this direction. I want to ask you, if you take the agency point of view, what would be the meaning of these variants? What would be either the hermeneutic or the interpretation for these variants and for this progression?
Yes. This passage of 5 to 6, 5 to 6, it's like the itsy bitsy spider, right? It's how you avoid parallel fifths as you climb upwards. It always has, for me, the hermeneutic of hope, of building up hopefulness. I find it in Haydn and Beethoven, wherever. It seems like it's always being used as a kind of internal uplifting. It's both earned by step, right, and anticipatory of some outcome. And so as you work up the sequence, and Bach, of course, enhances it with the chromatic in the bass, which becomes melodic as well, right? So it's a chromaticized 5/6 progression. Now, you might say that you could play this almost as though the upper part is the filigree on the more fundamental progression, which is that hopeful rise in the lower voices, right? It's interesting, too, because as I mentioned, he had just tonicized D, so that we hear the subdominant as though are we back in D? No, we know it has to be the subdominant, but we still have to earn our way towards the heavens, towards the goal of A. So this kind of gradual lift, it builds the suspense and the hope and the aspirational quality. So those are some generic terms. What it specifically means here, I can't tell you. But I go from these generic correlations and then work out individual interpretations that are very personal.
But then, thank you. So you'd see maybe a semantic trace of ascension there, even maybe a gesture of transcendence.
Possibly. However, as you heard, the remainder of that passage becomes quite dramatic, and it wedges outward, and that huge descent in the bass, a kind of grand gesture towards the cadence with intensity, right? So this is a major key work, but he manages to find ways to create the humaneness of dramatic intensity. The tragic is still lurking, if you will. It has a wonderful saraband, which is another whole story as well. Anyway, other questions?
Well, if there are no more questions, then I suggest we go for a coffee.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you very, very much, Robert. Excuse me. There is a question from the YouTube chat. I'll have to read that aloud for you.
We can let him go to the video.
Is it possible to carry? Yes. Well, sorry. This one last question. Somebody is asking here through the YouTube chat, how do you add to your view of Bach's music the narrowing opening of register, the confluence of opening of voices? Thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful question. I mentioned at the beginning of the Bach how it started in a lower register, the obligatory register, in which it also cadences. I left that paragraph out. But as it moves to the higher register, the tessiture and so forth, that's where the lower part becomes more melodic. So in other words, the register influence. You noticed I played the left hand very non-legato, almost as though it were kind of a continual oomph, oomph, in the first 4 bars. But then, as it became more melodic, I went ahead and sustained it to go with the finger pedal. Now, the registral thing that also pays out is whether you are collapsing inwardly, as those 2 diminished sevenths did, or whether you're expanding outward, as the last few measures of the Allemande refrain did, strain. And that goes outward to an extremity that is a true dramatic climax, just like for example, the E minor Sinfonia has a similar diminished seventh and then return. That same diminished seventh is projected out octaves in either side to a grand registral climax, if you will. You find the same thing in the E flat minor prelude from the WTC1. So register plays a key role. And in fact, it's the way he creates dynamics on an instrument that doesn't have the supposed capacity for dynamics. So register and density, and of course, affect through major versus minor mode and so forth. So does that answer?
I guess it does, yes. Thank you very much. Okay. I would like to nuance something about, now that you mentioned the continuo again,
Yes.
that I never meant to say you should not romanticize or you should do this or that, because I don't say that even to my students. Mm-hmm. So how could I dare to talk to you like that?
No.
Just in case. I know you didn't.
When I practice, I try very much to keep that left hand even.
Yeah.
And it's also true for Chopin. And in fact,
it is, yes.
There's
But
a wonderful.
I mean, my question was candidly asking, what do we represent in case we do this or that, not what we should do.
Exactly. But we may not do it in actual performance, but in practicing, it's the. We keep that left hand very even, and the right hand sounds even freer. Responded to that climax at the end. But it is a nice thing to practice with Chopin to try to be more disciplined with it and Unfortunately, I'm not disciplined as a pianist.
Oh, discipline. It's 11:06. Thank you very much again, Robert.